Hey gang, welcome back to our study of English spirituality. Today we're going to be looking at two saints in particular, uh, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and William of Saint Thierry. And they are the true inheritors, we would call them, of the spirituality given by their forefathers, Saint Augustine and Saint Benedict. If Saint Augustine laid the foundation for our spiritual life with the balance, striking the balance between doctrine and devotion, between knowledge and love, between head and heart. And St. Benedict gave us an orderly way, a structured way of living that intellectual and affective life in pursuit of Christian perfection. Then St. Bernard set that orderly praise on fire. Not meaning that he took the document and lit a lighter and disposed of it in a way as to leave no evidence, but I mean by setting it on fire that he took that orderly devotion and infused it or injected it with a very devout and intense zeal. And the zeal that he had was directed towards the sacred humanity of Jesus. We have this emphasis on Jesus's humanity as that which our carnal desire is pointed towards in the first steps of our love towards God. We're also going to look at William of Saint Thierry. Both Saint Bernard and William were 12th century French abbots in monasteries there in France. And we're going to look at them today as they exemplify for us what we call a unique humanism and a calm or sober optimism within the general characteristics of the English school of spirituality that we know today. And that's number three, actually, in those general characteristics that we've looked at. One being the synthesis of affect and intellect. Two, the unity of the church militant, particularly in terms of prayer. We looked at St. Benedict for embodying that. And then we are looking today at St. Bernard and William of St. Thierry for that third characteristic, a unique humanism and calm or sober optimism. We're going to look at why we think that they exemplify those things so well. And we're going to start with St. Bernard and the unique humanism that he develops for us. And well, first, let me sidestep here and reiterate why it is that we're looking at these saints and kind of the history of thought here. And that's when I say history of thought, that's not exactly what we're doing, although it seems that way and can kind of take that shape. We're not just looking at figures throughout our history and saying because they thought this, this is why we think thus. Although that is part of it. The reason why we're looking at these saints is because we, as we say in the Creed, we believe in the communion of saints. We believe that through their lives and the Spirit's work in their own life, they have given to us a living tradition. And so we take what the Spirit has done in their life, because we consider them saints partly because they were so acutely aware of and so cooperative with the grace of the Holy Spirit in their lives, that when we look at what they said about their life in cooperation with God's grace, we can see something very similar to their experience in our own lives. And that's why they become so rich to us. So we're looking at these saints not because we just like to do history, but because we believe that we are in communion with them through the same Spirit that gave life to their souls. So that's a little caveat back to our main content here. We get the unique humanism from St. Bernard, as I said before, through his emphasis on the sacred humanity of Jesus. It was an ancient heresy that the church really combated quite early and zealously, that Jesus was acknowledged to be God, but because he was God, he could not have possibly been human. And we see this heresy already being combated in some of the letters of the New Testament, particularly 1st and 2nd John. The Antichrist is the one who claims that Jesus has not come in the flesh, says John. And so what St. Bernard does is he turns that doctrine into a vivid and real affective devotion, the doctrine of Jesus's true humanity. He looks at the incarnation and says, how might I come to know the God who is veiled by this flesh? How might I come to know this God who has veiled himself in flesh? It's a remarkable question. And he does this, he starts this way because he sees himself. He does not try to be something he himself is not, anything more or less than human. And as humans, we are beings of flesh, beings of body and soul, integral beings of body and soul. So how might we, who are flesh and blood, pursue a God who is pure spirit? It seems to be a disconnect. And the answer for St. Bernard is the incarnation. So he goes like this. So there's a basic progression. Follow the progression. St. Bernard lays out four kind of stages, if you will, four, perhaps you'd call it emphases, in the journey of man's love for God. And he begins right where he ought to begin, and that is man as he is, or woman as she is. And so he says, we are human, that therefore we are enfleshed, and our movement towards God therefore must begin in the flesh. And this is proved to be something of a controversial point, obviously, because we remember Paul in his letters talking about how the flesh is the enemy of the spirit. And the way that Bernard frames it is that he understands that any movement upwards, is any movement towards God who is spirit, must begin exactly where we are. That is, beings of flesh, and therefore our movement towards God begins in the flesh. And he says this: the first stage is that man or woman first loves themselves for their own sake. The person is flesh and also incapable of knowing anything apart from himself and his experience. And we understand this largely to be true. We are flesh, and therefore we love ourselves for our own sake. And hopefully, in kind of hearing these stages, you'll be able to maybe identify where in the journey towards loving God you find yourself right now. Hopefully, some of these stages you can look back in your life and say, "Oh, I remember that. Like I remember that time when I really felt like this." Most of us in our childhood, because as infants and children, we are driven by our kind of more animal instincts, food, security, warmth. These are things that we require to a high degree as children in order to begin developing that more reasonable or rational part of our soul. And so we, for a long time in our younger life, we are simply interested in that which allows us to live. We love ourselves for our own sake. And then the second stage is when we come into contact with an idea of dependence or a sense of dependence. We feel that we acknowledge to some extent that we do not have the reason for our own existence within ourselves, that we must look to something outside of us to grant us meaning and purpose. We come into contact with a sense of dependence on something else that is not found within ourselves. And this is what St. Bernard would call the idea of God introduced into that fleshly or carnal person. And then that person's senses begins to understand God as much as possible and begins to love God for the person's own sake still. So we go from stage one, the man or woman loves themselves for their own sake. And then the second stage is this man or woman begins to love God for their own sake still. That they have this sense of dependence. They understand that there is a being out there who that maintains their existence, and then they begin to love that being because they understand of how dependent they are on him. This is the second stage. Man or woman loves God for their own sake. Now, the third stage is, I imagine some of you, if not most of you, will understand this to be the stage that you're in, that you have come to love God for his own sake, or you're on that kind of up that tick of the journey, that after this sense of dependence is felt and an idea of God is introduced, and you begin to love God for your own sake through cooperation with grace, prompted by your own needs, you begin to worship. You begin to seek God's presence by meditation. You begin to read, to pray, to seek obedience, and you pass into this third stage of the love of God, love for God, which is loving God for his own sake. And this is the life of cooperation with God's grace. And this, I think, is where hopefully most of us as adult Christians have found ourselves. And so this is probably where most of us will remain for a very long time, developing that love for God's own sake. But this is not the final stage that St. Bernard gives to us. He gives this the fourth stage, which is what he calls Christian perfection. And it's not really what you think you would think it would be. That we've already achieved this stage of loving God for his own sake, acknowledging that he alone is worthy of our love. But St. Bernard goes one step further and says the fourth stage is when man or woman loves themselves solely for the sake of God. So that love is then returned to us as we originally knew it, but it's no longer for our sake, but for his sake. We love ourselves for God's sake. And it's a really fascinating stage of progression. And honestly, because I haven't gotten there yet, I don't really know what that sounds or looks like. I think St. Bernard, to some degree, probably understood it. And this is where the richness of the saints come in, because we can read what he says about his own experience through these stages. And I think it's remarkable. So he gives us this very unique humanism. If man is carnal, then carnal love is where man must begin. The incarnation is where we must start. That man must begin to love God through the incarnation, which is the first step to loving the divinity that the incarnation veils. And so the devotion that St. Bernard derives from the doctrine of the incarnation is meditation on the sacred humanity of Jesus. And this is where we take the stories of Jesus's life from the gospel narratives, and we plant them into our minds and our souls, and we begin to allow our souls to imagine and flesh the scene, if you will, and we begin to meditate on Jesus's sacred humanity, and that begins to burn in us a desire, a love for Jesus, our Lord, through his humanity, because he becomes infinitely relatable to us. And we also can kind of see, this is a sidebar here, the need for the scriptures to come out in a language in which regular people, can understand them. Again, this is St. Bernard. He's writing in the 12th century. The Vulgate was the main, if not the exclusive language. The Latin version of the Bible was the exclusive Bible of the empire, of the entire Western world. And so how does a regular parishioner begin to meditate on the stories of Jesus's life through the narratives of his life without having access to those in a language that he or she can understand? And so a lot of us who kind of grew up not per se Catholic, but in a more Protestant denomination, have probably heard that It was the Reformation that really kind of gave us the scriptures in vernacular language, meaning in the language of each individual people group. So, you get the scriptures translated into German, you get the scriptures translated into French and English, instead of just having Latin for everybody that nobody could understand. So we see through this emphasis on the sacred humanity, St. Bernard really opens the door, even just a little crack, for the scriptures to come to humanity in their own languages, which was unheard of at the time, but became a couple hundred years later, 300 years later in the 1500s, is where the Reformation really started taking that idea and running with it. And then we get the kind of prolific translations of the New Testament, especially in German and English. So the implications of the sacred humanity led St. Bernard to interpret the love of God in terms of eros and philia. I think most of us as Christians have probably heard of the love of God explained as agape, which is completely legitimate and appropriate and fitting. But St. Bernard, because of his emphasis, the implications of a devotion to the sacred humanity of Jesus, helps kind of relate that love to us a little bit better. Agape can come across as very godlike. It is self-sacrificing, which is a very difficult characteristic or quality to have, especially fleshly people, carnal people. Agape isn't where we begin. It might be where we end, but that's an adult diet, and most of us are hanging out on milk and pureed food still in terms of how we love and how well we love. And so Bernard is very pastoral, and he brings this love of God down to us as eros, that is romantic love, and philia, that is brotherly or friendship love, because the implication of the incarnation, the infleshing of the eternal Son of God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, tells us that God desires reconciliation with a friend, with a brother or sister, that God desires an intimate communion with us, that the bridegroom delights in the bride and the bride delights in the bridegroom, and we have this wonderful love given to us or shown to us in the incarnation. It's not just that God is on high up in the clouds and deeming that we should be better, and so he sacrifices himself so that we could do those things that he wishes us to do. It is that he comes to us in the incarnation in a brotherly or sisterly, a friendly way, and that begins to grow our love for him in a way that we are able to understand and relate to. So the unique humanism that Bernard develops can probably be best explained in this way, or captured in this way: that man or woman knowing themselves most intimately, that is, having a true self-knowledge, is despicable in their own sight. That sounds rather pessimistic, and we're talking about a unique humanism and a unique optimism. But also this man or this woman who has a true knowledge of themselves is despicable and unworthy of God's love, knows themselves to be the recipients of God's love, a true and intimate and burning love that he has for us. And we have this in the incarnation, the movement of God towards us. If there was a true disciple of St. Bernard, he had many disciples, but if there was a true disciple that we found in our own school represented, it would be Marjorie Kemp, and we will get to her later. But she always called herself the dear worthy darling, the darling creature of our Lord. And in that, you get that sense of self-knowledge, true self-knowledge, acknowledging herself as a creature, as a sinful creature, but also the recipient of his affection and love, intimate, friendly love. All right, so that's our unique optimism. We're going to move on to our calm or sober. I'm sorry, that was our unique humanism. We're going to move on to our calm or sober optimism. And we're looking to William of St. Thierry for this. Two things I want to highlight for him or with him is that he really emphasized a sense of continuity in Christian living and the sane authority of the rule of the church. And that here's what those things mean. That the sense of continuity in Christian living comes from or comes through submission to the sane authority of the rule of the church. If we embrace the rule of Holy Church, the threefold regula, embracing the offices, Mass, and personal devotions, then those, instead of being viewed as doses of God's grace, meaning that we live our life and intermittently through that life we come to the fountain of grace and we receive our dose and then we move on. Instead of that, that's pushed aside by William, and he gives us this sense of continuity, not doses of God's grace, but an immersion in the river of grace, and the embracing of the offices, Mass, and personal devotion give us that sense that we are fully in that river of grace, and therefore we sense there is a sense of continuity in our life and our devotion. And if you have embraced this rule, if you have embraced the holy rule, the rule of Holy Church, and you have come to experience this on your own, you know what I'm speaking of. That when you come to the Eucharist on Sunday, it's no longer kind of an island, isolated, this is where I do church, because you have been doing church all week long, morning and evening prayer, and then probably with some measure of personal devotion thrown in there as well, Lectio Divina or something like that. So you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, this sense of continuity. And what that does is that begins to grow a trust that everything that you encounter is coming to you by the will of God. The sense of continuity, it surrounds your life, that your life begins to embrace everything that you experience as the will of God. And what that really begins to do is ground the Christian in this ancient teaching of what we call God's providence, that his sovereignty, that every moment that we live is upheld by his loving will, that we are at every moment being willed into being, that God by his love for us is in a moment by moment basis giving us being. Me sitting here at this table, the being that I have, the being that this table has, that the flowers beside me have, these are all being upheld moment by moment by the loving will of our Father. And when we begin to be rooted and grounded in that, any circumstance that comes our way, good or bad, we understand that it's come to us by the loving will of God. He loves us, and therefore he has given us everything that we need to endure it, to enjoy it, to grow from it, and that always implants in our souls a very calm, sober optimism, because this does not neglect the presence of suffering. And in fact, it looks at it and says, God is using suffering in this world to redeem this world, just as we see him doing from the cross. William looks at the rule of the church and the sense of continuity, and he says, how do we respond to the love of God every day, all day? Because God's grace is upon us through everything that comes to us, because he is willing it at every moment. His grace is obviously infused in all of it as well. How do we respond to that grace? The optimism comes from the ability to see the mystery of God's will in every minute of our life and all minutiae of our daily life. And then we get the fruition of this idea. William St. Thierry was a 12th century abbot that wrote quite a bit, and we get the fruition or the true inheritor of his spirituality embodied in Dame Julian of Norwich. And this is where we begin to see a particularly English um, carrying on of this living tradition. And this calm or sober optimism comes through Julian and her writings, because Julian herself was living in incredibly tumultuous times. She saw the assassination of a king. She saw the assassination of an archbishop in her time. There were institutions that had been around for hundreds of years that had crumbled and fallen apart. She had witnessed 3 bouts of the Black Plague that had come through Norwich, her own town, and I think wiped out about 50% of the people in her own town. And in light of all of that, in her writings, you can see this clear optimism that she carries, this undeniable and unshakable hope that in light of everything that was happening, all manner of things shall be well. And this just is not naive. She was always struggling with the presence of suffering in front of her face, never really answering or finding clarity to that issue for her, but her hope was in this idea that God was the one who was behind it all, and he was ultimately loving, and that his love always outpaced his wrath. Calm and sober optimism from William of St. Thierry, whose true daughter, if you will, was Dame Julian of Norwich, as we see in her own writings. So I think that that's probably a good place to wrap up. These are our 2 saints looking at our 3rd characteristic of the English school. Unique humanism through St. Bernard, calm or sober optimism through William of St. Thierry. So come back next week. We'll be talking about the foundation of life as liturgy. That is the office, mass, and personal devotion derived from the scriptures. And we'll be looking at the school of St. Victor, the Victorines, as we'll call them, as well as the Franciscans, that wonderfully known but often misunderstood saint, St. Francis, and how they begin to transform this sense of continuity in the Christian life to this idea of habitual recollection, the ability not only to acknowledge that God's will is coming to us at every moment, but our ability to see it, to recollect, to remember that it is that every moment of the day, especially in and through creation. So thanks so much for joining us. This was our trek through and to a distinct school of spirituality called the English School. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.